This is going to be week 10. Week 10. Week 10, we are going to discuss birth stories. Now, you might be sitting here thinking, I've never had a baby or I don't plan on having a baby. And this is not just what this is about. So, there will be time to discuss birth in a way that feels resonant to you because birth matters for your birth, as in the way you came into this world, and if you have had any babies. So, first and foremost, I'm going to speak to your birth and your birth story. And then there's going to be a part of this which talks to birth stories for babies. And then there's an accompanying PDF on your birth story and a birth debrief. Ever been through a birth debrief, as in you've given yourself time to debrief fully from your birth, properly from your birth, not just with a lens of shoulda, woulda, coulda, or through the medical system, for example, if that was there, really giving yourself time to be with what came up emotionally, physically, and spiritually, then this is going to be such a beautiful cathartic process, but also it might be a lot. So, first, let's speak to your birth story and why that matters. If we're talking about your root and your pelvis as your safe space, as the safety of it all, how you felt coming into this world genuinely matters with how safe you feel. And we also have to remember that we were an egg in our mother, in our grandmother. So we really want to talk to the ancestral holding that we have and the stories that we hold on to in our pelvis and what they create for us. This might seem either far-fetched or might feel really welcomed, but I really just want to acknowledge where you're at and take what you want and leave the rest. However, what I've often seen is that people who say that they have had an interesting look back at where their grandmother was at can then create some level of puzzle piece placing because they'll be like, oh, now that actually does make sense. Really good example is I really love talking to women who have an Irish history. So it might be like Irish mother or Irish grandmother, and there is a lot of Irish holding in the pelvis. So things like babies out of wedlock, and the Catholic Church. These create stories and narratives that then the women that I see in my space are holding in their own pelvis, which creates an element of feeling unsafe. Sometimes it can be an abortion, sometimes it can be a baby out of wedlock, sometimes it can be the hiding of the woman when she was pregnant and then coming back out into society, and so on and so forth. These narratives are held within her root because, of course, they are, because she was there at that time and she continues to be in this journey with whatever's been there through the lineage and not been tended to. And she becomes the cycle breaker, the circuit breaker. She becomes the one that has to tend to those stories. It's like, how do we end up with such deep period pains and endometriosis and so on and so forth when we're so young? When actually, probably what we're looking at is the fact that the world overall, society overall, and our history and our lineage have not been tending to what it means to be a woman. There's been a lot of hiding, there's been a lot of ignorance, there's been a lot of shame, and then there's grief, and there's anger, and there's frustration, and it's all repressed, and it's all just manifesting within that space. And then we have to hold it. There's a lot to hold. So those stories and those narratives matter, and really just to give yourself time and space to be with anything that comes up when you think about that, first and foremost. And this is not going to be able to be a course that brings up everything and sorts everything and brings level of completion for everything because there's so much that can come up from this space. But I like to plant seeds. That's what this is about. It's planting seeds and giving you tools that you can be with if anything comes up around certain conversations and certain narratives and so on and so forth. But you might need further support outside of this course and outside of this space. That's to speak to that, the lineage and the history and the holding that exists within the pelvis, and it is seen. I see it in this space. It does exist. There's also a lot of holding for those who are BIPOC, for those who have a history of being weaponized and used in our history and being ignored. that is hugely problematic for the BIPOC community, and there are more menstrual problems there. There are more challenges around endometriosis and pain, and also, of course, there's a lot of childbirth related stats that exist out there for those in the BIPOC community who are being bypassed and ignored, and their pain is being ignored. We do not ignore this. This is a huge problem, and this is then being held in the pelvis of those in those communities, and it needs to be acknowledged, and needs to be heard, and it needs to be tended to. So I want to raise that as well. So we're going to move into discussions around your birth. Now, your relationship with your mother, it could be on any level of scale, but I'm wondering whether you've ever had a conversation with your mother around your birth, if that is potentially an option for you. To have a conversation around your birth can be really, really healing. So if you've never thought about things like how birth started, was there an induction process, or was it a physiological start of that birth? Where were you birthed? Were you birthed in hospital, in home, in your mother's home, in your grandmother's home? And then thinking about your own history. So do you have a relationship with your birth mum? Were you adopted? Do you now have a relationship with your mum? What and who was present at your birth? How were you entering into this world? Did you go and enter through C-section? Did you enter through forceps or Von-2s? Did you enter this world physiologically? And then did you have delayed cord clamping, or did you not have delayed cord clamping? How were you received in those early days by your mother, by your family, and so on and so forth? How you entered this world matters. One of the ways that we are silencing women and silencing the children that enter this world is through birth. And in 2025, when I start recording this, I like to just give that point of reference, because at this point when I record this, C-section rates have started to outdo the rates of vaginal births. If you are on the ward with women giving birth, there's silence, and it's eerily strange to be on a ward with silence. I'm also a doula, and I have witnessed a few births over the years, and I've been on labor wards and there's silence. Women are being silenced through birth, and babies are being silenced, and that matters. So, how do you feel at root is part of your birth story, because how you feel safe in this world is how you entered in this world and you took your first breath and you landed into the space that is society, the world that it is, and how you were received, how you were finding safety and love. For example, if you entered into this world and you were placed in a cot next to your mother or wheeled away and you weren't with your mother, or if you were in NICU and so on and so forth, all those stories can live in the body and can matter and can impact how you feel at root and how you have continued on your life to find safety from that. So have you continued on your journey to undo that and find more safety, or do you feel like you've continued from that moment and remained in this general just landing in spaces where you continue to remind yourself of those patterns of being unsafe, because that feels safer for the body to find yourself in the arms of being unsafe, rather than really sitting with what it would mean to be in the arms of safety when there has been a level of unsafety growing up. It's really interesting how we will vibrate towards situations that might feel just more familiar, therefore they might continue to feel unsafe because familiar spaces are unsafe spaces. So really thinking about what's coming up for you there. So to continue to be with that, be with the journaling questions around that, see what comes up for you. And that closes our week 10, and gives you time just to be with the journaling and be with what's coming up there and the seeds around that, reminding yourself of the overarching journaling questions that we have, and then allowing yourself to come back to tools that we've been with, any somatic practices, anything else, finding those glimmers when you start to think about these conversations. Celebrating you and sending love as you move into the next part of this video, or as you close and gently be with yourself. We're going to touch on what it means to tend to our birth story today. So, watching this before having your birth is very welcomed, and equally watching this video after the birth. Feel free to be with whatever feels necessarily in the energetic space that you're in. So, what often happens is that when we've been through a birth, we often don't touch on the story or believe that the story lives in our bodies. And I often see when a woman has had the birth that they would deem their dream birth scenario, that they still feel like they can't tend to it because they had their dream birth scenario. But of course, every birth leaves some kind of imprint within the body and within our emotional and spiritual bodies. And so, if we're not actually tending to our birth blueprint, if we're not attending to the birth that we've had, then we're missing a huge piece of the puzzle for tending to our nervous systems and tending to our pelvic floors and tending to ourselves as a puzzle piece that needs to be placed back together after that experience. I speak to this as somebody who has worked with a lot of women in person, and so I am blessed with having seen a range of experiences that are held in the body for women. And I have seen some wild scenarios in my space that really reminded me and were really humbling around what it means to not process the birth experience through the pelvic floor area and not really acknowledging that this isn't just something that needs to be talked through. Yes, there's a place for it to be spoken through, but we need to physically be moving it through the body. So, when it comes to your birth story, there's ways and means of supporting this. The first way that you're going to be supporting this is by being on this course and journeying with the processes. Now, for example, when you do a vaginal steam, or when you do a vaginal smoking, or when you do a womb massage, or when you work with the fascia, you are going to be continuously processing your birth story. If you weren't doing any of those things, you're not processing the birth story from within the body, and it's not going to allow for you to process the birth story somatically. So it continues to live in the body. It continues to live in the pelvic floor in some way. And then what happens is that there may be discomfort during sex or a lack of pleasure, a lack of wholeness, the inability to be with your pelvic floor. So there's absolutely no tightening within that space. There's a complete disconnect in order to protect ourselves from anything that might have happened. Or there could be hypertonic floor where there's constant tension because of the constant bracing of something going wrong or something happening again to our bodies. So what we really want to acknowledge is that there's a whole spectrum that can happen, and there's also a whole as a result of the birth. I can't speak to exactly what's going to manifest for you because everybody is so different. But I will say that everybody's birth story leaves an imprint and needs processing, even if you think it was the birth that you wanted, and even if you feel like it's a birth that you can't face talking about and being with. It's so, so important. There are many signs that can come up for somebody in your vicinity, in your group, in your friendship group, in your family, of somebody who hasn't tended to their birth story. This could be wanting to tell you the whole story about their birth, tell you every little detail, and you being left feeling like you've been through a washing machine. This can be somebody who shuts down when there's any conversation around birth. This could be somebody who hears that you might want a certain type of birth and that triggers them. This can often happen with relationships with mothers and mother-in-laws. This can often happen because their story and their narrative hasn't been tended to. And so that's one of the ways that you can see that their pelvic story hasn't been tended to. So also, of course, we have this journey with pregnancy and not just the birth, but pregnancy. And sometimes there can be something to unpick and unpack there. So allowing for whatever's there to be held and to allow for that to come up. What you will find is you will find a PDF with questions. These questions are for you and your partner to tend to that story. So there'll be questions for you, questions for your partner. I would make a really yummy evening of it and have time to process the birth together. These are normally facilitated in my space by me literally holding a couple in that story and allowing for what needs to be spoken to from the woman and from the partner. These can be a really fascinating and really challenging conversation. And so you're so welcome to email me hello at thisisnaomigirl.co.uk and ask that. I hold that space with you both. I'm so happy to do that, and it would be an honor to do that. And then what that means is that you are not bypassing, you're just simply saying, I would love to have someone else's perspective in the space who can hold that space with us. And often what happens is I do very, very little, but it enables for the flow of the conversation to keep on the track. And I know I have my own husband and we have our own conversations, and sometimes it can deviate, and sometimes we both need someone to just bring it back to where we really want the outcome to go. And so, if you print off the questions and you look at them and you think that's not something I can face, if your birth story was derailed by a midwife or a certain situation, or that it was a challenge for you and your partnership, or any of that, and it feels just too much to speak to it, but you don't want to go down the counselling route, you don't want to keep going on about it, then I would say that having a conversation together could be the first step. But if that doesn't feel welcomed and as easeful as you'd like it to be, then book in a conversation with me and let's just have this really beautiful chat together and see what comes up from it. And then you're going to continue to process through the tools that you have in this course. It's everything. In a world where we live with such a challenge to consistently keep our relationship as healthy as it possibly can be, you're doing such big work, and I'm here like celebrating, cheerleading you both on this. It literally gives me goosebumps thinking about whenever a couple tends to this story in this way. Let's talk about what's going to come up then through the birth story. So everything can come up through the birth story, and how it can feel before having had the birth story. So if there are some unresolved challenges in the relationship or for yourself as a woman, then they will potentially come up within your birth story, even though they weren't specifically part of your birth story. And so, what we really, really want to allow is we really want to allow for this space and time to really be in the narrative that unfolded. So, we want to be with who was part of the birth story, what was part of the birth story, what energy was in that you welcomed, and what energy was in that you didn't feel was welcomed. Were there any family members involved in that story? And that could be linked to boundaries as parents. What I love to see is around this conversation is how it impacts our ability to parent and be with that moving forward. How is it that everything that unfolded during pregnancy and birth can lend itself to the boundaries and the parenting that you have now? I really love how we can think about this whole journey. And so, if there was leaky energy, so for example, I don't know, only basing it on what I've seen and what I experienced for myself, a mother-in-law because sometimes we have amazing mother-in-laws and sometimes we can have ruptured relationships with our mother-in-laws. A mother-in-law or a mother, again, same thing, uh, projects her fears and projects her way of parenting, and that includes when being pregnant, onto you trying to protect that, the couple in general, sometimes the partner trying to protect that from the other partner, and then the other partner not necessarily protecting that in a way that the partner wants it to be protected, if you get my drift. So then what happens is that the protection isn't happening, or the overprotection happens, and it creates rupture and challenge and arguments. And so then what happens is that if we cannot hold that energy of the projecting person coming into the relationship and creating a crater rift that can sometimes happen, then what happens is that creates leaky energy in our ability to process the journey to that point to parenting, and can create challenge within the parenting itself. And so what we have to do is we have to acknowledge what's coming up and speak to it and work out how we can tend to that relationship. It can also be during birth where there was a certain narrative that was projected onto the woman. So, for example, you shouldn't go over 42 weeks. A woman saying, I want to allow the baby to come when they're ready. Sometimes there can be senior midwives or midwives in general or midwife appointments who can be quite forceful with this narrative around don't go over 42 weeks, your baby will die. And that often happens in today's medicalized society of birth. And so we have to be really careful and gentle with then what can happen as a result of that. So for some women, they can hold that and be like, I'm okay with what happens after 42 weeks. I've done my research, I've read the research, and I'm okay with the research. And I'm careful with what I've read, and I'm going to hold that and I'm going to allow the baby to come in their own time. And then a woman who feels that that feels too much and that they are going to go down the medicalized route because that feels like the safest option for her right now. And everything is part and parcel of your journey, okay? And I am someone who was pushed into not going over 42 weeks with my first child. And so that's just one example of where the pressure can come from the medical journey. And only retrospectively can we look back at the outcome and at what we decide. Like when we're in it, we're literally trying to make the best informed decisions that we can make from that place that we're in. And so we need to allow for whoever or whatever energy is coming into the space. And then we need to process that and we need to move it through. If we do not, that person, that energy will live in the body. And so that's really important as part of the birth story. How the baby came will impact how you process the birth. If, for example, you are somebody who was hell bent on never being anywhere near a C-section and you ended up in a C-section, and believe me, I have witnessed this whole journey, that can be some powerful shit to have to sit with. And what comes up when we think about that? If you are somebody who simply just wanted a C-section and were very happy to have a C-section, and then last minute decided that you were going to go for a vaginal birth and it still landed in a C-section, that can be something that is needing a lot of processing, because it can be a journey where you made a decision and then you changed your decision and then the decision was taken out of your hands. If you're somebody who wanted a free birth, for example, and then the free birth ended up in a situation where you ended up in hospital after all, that's going to need processing. That's going to need processing because you're going to start questioning why you went down the free birth route in the first place if you ended up in the hospital, or what meant that it took the journey to ending up in that way. How can you be with your choices? Whatever those choices were, how can you be with them and be tending to your body and tending to your heart space and acknowledging that anything that happened was meant in that moment, and that all your choices have meant and lent themselves to becoming and being in this moment as the parent, as the mother, as the father, as the journey. It's all part and parcel of it. There's nothing to change. There's no shoulda, woulda, coulda, because there's no point in that. It's simply allowing for the acknowledgement of what happened and then being in this acceptance of that happened. And yeah, there's rage and anger or grief and loss and sadness. That's birth. Birth is it's 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 birth and it's death. It's both. And if you're not holding both, then you're missing the point of birth in the first place. And sometimes there is literally a death. And I've witnessed that. And sometimes there is also complete and utter trauma that needs to be held. And sometimes there's the death of the relationship that was, the person that was, the woman that was. This then becomes a rebirth into what it means to tend to ourselves and our relationship. And so there can be so much that can come up around it. And I can't give you all the answers in this space. And if we were working together on a one-to-one, there would be probably more that we could tend to. But certainly in this space, the PDF questions are going to give you time to be with things you probably hadn't thought about before. And also, even just talking about it now will give you time to process and be with the narrative that happens so that you can literally just be in that processing of it. And as time goes on and as time moves on, more might come up around it. You might not be ready to process it all right now. You can't speak to it all right now necessarily, but it's certainly sowing the seeds so that you can speak to it as and when necessary as time goes on. And I still feel that I'm processing my births, and my son is 9 this year. And so there is no rush, but to acknowledge that it does need processing. Because if you don't process it, it sits in the body and it can create and manifest. And I've seen that. I've seen that. We want to move it. We want to tend to it. We want to acknowledge it. We want to hear it. And we don't want to tell our birth story to the unsuspecting pregnant Sandra down the road who really doesn't want to hear a traumatic birth story or anyone's birth story, to be honest. Sandra's quite happy in her own little way. And so what we have to do is acknowledge that we don't want to be in this moment where we're projecting and sharing and telling everybody about the fears and the shouldas and the woulda and the couldas, because that's for you, that's for your journey. And we only ever want to support and be with somebody else's choices, just as you were supported in your choices. And so that's why I find it so fascinating around our birth culture and our sharing and everything else that can come up when we think about birth. And so go gently. This is not a rush. This is not a race. And this part of this journey for you is to plant the seeds, and you might not be ready to talk about it yet, and you might not be ready to do the PDF questions yet, certainly. And so if I was working with a couple, then normally that would come towards the end. It would be probably our penultimate session or our last session where we talk about the birth story. And so what I see is that even then it can feel challenging to talk about, but so necessary. But you're not necessarily going to have that support. So give yourself the time, but also don't forget about it. So it needs to come in that kind of very perfect, timely manner. Continue to do all the rest of this and be with these seeds and tend to yourself when something comes up and allow yourself to be with that tending and that mothering and that acknowledgement. And when it's ready, you can continue to talk and move it through. Always expansion, contraction, tending, expansion, talking, opening, being, and then tending. So much love.